it's really amazing to see such a phenomenal piece of art, and then also see all the law and policy that I deal with every day. But probably most of you are familiar with this, but the reason the phrase military-age males is it was first reported by the New York Times that this was a standard that the administration was using when identifying who could be killed. The personality strikes that you heard about, that's a person, that's the prophet or someone with a name people have identified for whatever reason that this person can be killed, and that's going after a person. But this concept came out that people who were military-age males could be killed. And in fact, the article where this was first articulated was a little more nuanced than that. What it actually said is if people are killed by a drone or another weapon, and we don't know who they are, if you look at the bodies and they're military-age males, we just assume that they were combatants. We don't assume they were civilians, which is actually what the laws of war require, but you assume they're combatants. And so this sort of spun out in the public that the people who were being targeted were just military-age males, which is, as you can imagine, and as we saw in the play, you just look at them and they look old enough to carry a weapon, and they probably are because they're in environments where most men their age carry weapons, and the perception is that's what makes them a lawful target. And I think that's so poignant because it gets to what people are scared about when it comes to drones and targeted killing, this idea that you could be targeted for any reason, a reason that you can't control. You're a 20-year-old man in Pakistan, and that's potentially a death sentence.
As an audience member, many of the themes that it hit are themes that I've written about in my work and dealt with the real world versions of this, but it's very different for me to watch it be performed and in a setting like this on a very personal level, and it all brought together in a single moment, so it's incredibly intense. Whereas for me as a writer and an analyst, and it was strange, you mentioned there was kind of a feedback loop going on between some of the stuff that I'd written in the play, but for me it plays out over a course of years, so there's little bits and pieces that might have happened over the course of years. What I'm kind of getting at, to see it in this setting all packaged together in an hour, and a performance that powerful, hits you very hard. So that's one, and it points to the power of art. To provoke different emotions, drive things home in a way that you're not going to get in a book, a newspaper, a blog, whatever. I thought it hit really well the mixed emotions that this situation, this technology provokes, the mixed emotions that she experiences as a Air Force officer. You're on one hand, in whatever the circumstances, a number of people have gone through being traditional pilots and then moving into this space. And I remember talking with an F-15 pilot who was given squadron command in one of the first units of this, and he was promoted to squadron command. This is normally a good thing in your career, and all of his buddies were like, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And so they captured really well that mixed emotion. I think captured well the mixed emotion of killing but not feeling risk, and that's both good, but it kind of doesn't feel right. Third, the mixed emotion that I think we're all feeling right now but isn't it good that she could stay home with her family and not be at risk? And isn't it good we're not sending Americans into harm's way? Whatever the foreign policy situation right now, drones are a popular solution to it, and we're experiencing this right now in the discourse over Iraq. Don't know what to do. Maybe drones are the answer. So that mixed emotions there. We have to be careful about mixing different things. This was a depiction of a U.S. Air Force character in a overt war operating in Iraq. So the situation that we talked about of the setting was of the military-age males was a traditional rules of engagement, U.S. troops on the ground, overt, a convoy, people being seen doing something. That's different than what you brought up, which was the covert side of this, drone strikes into Pakistan, not falling under military law, people not being court-martialed if they do something right or wrong. We've conflated two very different things: overt military operations in support of troops on the ground, terrorists, cross-border black world, covert, not under, all the different, we fudge them together because they both involve the very same technology. And we wouldn't normally do that. It's a lot like, you know, combining, just because you use a gun in a robbery and in war, it's not fundamentally the same thing. And so we conflate drone into very different things that are going on in the world. And we need to be careful of this when we're watching this play.
Interesting. You want to, I guess.
Well, I would disagree a little bit because I think in Afghanistan we have both. We have force protection, which is standard, which was, you know, there's a convoy on the road and maybe someone has placed something on the road and we need to protect our troops, which could happen in any number of ways, including by drone. And then we do have different
But the
types of
memo you
targeted
mentioned and
killings.
the like had nothing to do with that was not Afghan U.S. military operations. That was talking about intelligence community, Pakistan, the fact that it had to come out through, what we've recently seen, declassified memos and the like. There's just even a location in Creech Air Force Base, they're very different things. And I think that's actually why we're seeing a push towards moving many of the things that have been done by the intelligence community over to the military because of the clear chain of command, legal issues, et cetera. But as the play shows out, there's still going to be lots of consequences on that.
Well, I think people hear drone and we think one thing, and as you're bringing up, the drone is a weapon. This
Right.
could be a manned aircraft. I mean, we'd have a different personal experience.
Sure.
But the people could be killed by a manned aircraft and it would have the same impact. Manned aircrafts usually drop Hellfires, which is the same weapon that a drone does. And people think of drone, they think targeted killing, which is maybe a quasi-legal term that some of us use, but they're very different things. And, you know, Human Rights Watch also does a lot of work on fully autonomous weapons, drones that can fly themselves and select their own targets. But again, that's a very different issue, different technology and different legal and ethical issues. But one of the interesting things when you poll Americans about drones, generally Americans are pretty supportive of drones. They like the idea. I mean, this country is very tired of war. Nobody wants to send boots on the ground anywhere. But when you talk about civilian casualties, the polling numbers change. Because when people hear stories about people killed by drones or targeted killing, they think the prophet. They don't think the little girl at the same time. And Human Rights Watch has documented civilian casualties from drone strikes, particularly in Yemen. We've done a lot of on-the-ground documentation. We've documented our civilians who've died in violation of the laws of war. Drone strikes or strikes using manned aircraft that either produce an excessive number of civilian casualties, which makes them unlawful, or where the operators fail to properly distinguish between civilians and combatants. And you hear in this play a lot of the attempt to distinguish, and you know, that guy doesn't have the limp, he's not the target, which is good, that's what we want. We want people to take the time. And often mistakes happen. But you know, one really poignant case that always gets to people when they hear about it is a particular killing in Yemen. And there was a preacher, a cleric, who would preach against Al-Qaeda. His sermons were telling people in his village not to join Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, not to be violent, that violent jihad was not part of what they should be doing. And the local Al-Qaeda members got pretty pissed off at him, and they said they wanted a meeting. And he agreed to meet with them out behind the mosque, and he asked his cousin, who is the police officer of the town, to come with him for protection. So they go out behind the mosque, half the community stands around watching, the Al-Qaeda guys show up, and the four of them are killed by drone. Now, was it lawful? Quite possibly. Was it a good idea? That was a really bad idea. That was a really poor decision on the part of the US government to kill this guy, to kill the police officer, to take out an ally, and to alienate an entire community where everyone, if they weren't there and they didn't watch it happen in person, they saw the photos and the video afterwards. The other thing that I find people are really surprised to learn about is that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the US government and allied forces provide compensation to civilians who suffer from war. If members of their families are killed or if their property is damaged, they provide no-fault compensation. They're called ex gratia payments. So you don't have to prove that you were innocent. You might have, the damage might have been lawful. Collateral damage is what it's called. But nevertheless, the US and its allies figured out it's a pretty good idea to pay people some form of compensation and apologize for what happened. That does not happen in Yemen, and it does not happen in Pakistan, because the US government doesn't actually admit that it conducts any of these strikes. So it's like these hundreds of people who've been killed in Yemen and Pakistan, they don't exist to the US government. And that has a really serious consequence for the people who live in these countries.
The one other point that I wanted to make, and it kind of connects to the themes you were bringing up, is again to distinguish between battlefield use of this in an overt war zone versus these, targeted strikes, high value, however you want to put it, moving beyond into a Pakistan or Yemen. I'm the son of a JAG officer, one of the horrible lawyers who speaks in their ear during it, and there's a fundamental difference between these contexts, because in a war zone, its identity doesn't matter, action matters. So you don't have to know whether it's Jim or Bob, it's just the fact that they're shooting a rifle at you. And if you thought it was Jim and it turned out to be Bob, no problem. It was the act that they undertook. When you move into these strikes that we've been doing in a Pakistan, in a Yemen, where we can describe them as high value targeting or preemptive, the only way to get this person, identity becomes key, because you're not seeing them pulling the trigger. You're saying this is someone who one day will pull the trigger, or they previously pulled the trigger. And so identity is crucial. If you think it's Jim and it turns out to be Bob, you've made a fundamental catastrophic mistake. And that's part of this difference of true traditional war zone versus this quasi not so covert wars that we've been fighting in other places. And that's also why, to me, it's so important that you move this outside of an intelligence community setting where no one has been prosecuted for anything other than leaking information to the press over the last several years, versus we can argue it, we can debate it, but within the military system, there is an accountability system. We've had investigation, we've had people court-martialed. We can argue how good the point is there's a system that we know that works. And that's why a lot of us want this move from intel world over to the military side, and particularly from the covert side to the more overt side.
Can you just talk
And sorry, one thing to add, because we're in the British, everything that I talked about, the UK is going to be going through. They haven't done at least not known in the press, the covert drone strikes, but they've fired more than 200 of the Hellfire missiles that are mentioned in this in support of battlefield operations. And by my count, it's 76 other countries have military robotics right now. Well, I think you're seeing an evolution of the discourse about what is a revolutionary technology. So, a couple years back, I remember sitting down with a senator and having to explain that there was not a little person inside of a Predator drone. And, the idea of a robotic plane was something that was truly out of science fiction. And then you get to the next stage of it that I kind of mentioned of, this is the only game in town. And that sort of enthusiasm on the policy side, which is matched by the shock and discomfort on the, particularly the Air Force side. And not, but the point is that you get sort of a very thin discourse on both sides. And now we're seeing a tepid embrace on both sides. So the military, on one hand, this is the fastest growing field along with cyber within the Air Force. On the other hand, it's creating a lot of kind of angst, and it's going back and forth, but we're not moving away from it. And that story, in the play of the top dogs, that's part of the change. But that's also, that tepid embrace is happening in the public policy space, where the report that Stimson did and others, I think, reflects a growing conventional wisdom that we're not getting rid of these. We're going to continue to use them because we don't have any other great option. On the other hand, it's giving me a little bit of angst of where we've ended up in it. And so that's the change. And frankly, think we're seeing that in the arts too. Compare this, and it's not fair to do this, but to some of the really cruddy Hollywood stuff of, whether it was, I'm trying to think of the first depiction I remember seeing of a Predator drone was, of course, in It Takes Life and tries to hunt down Shia LaBeouf. I mean, that's, that was always the robot narrative. And now we're moving it into the real world.
I think that one of the most important things is that this conversation has to take place internationally. The U.S., it has changed much more recently, but certainly, 12 or 13 years ago, the U.S. was the primary operator, operating in coalition, of course, in Afghanistan, but it still is the behemoth. And this idea of targeted killings, whether by drone or otherwise, but selecting a person to kill, and it's pretty much the U.S. and Israel, which are the only countries that do that. So it's still a pretty narrow group. One of the things that we do is we push other countries to take part in this conversation and say that you need to be prepared for a world where other countries do this. So China actually hasn't done this, but they talked about it. They said they would do it against a drug trafficker from Burma, and then they changed their minds and didn't launch a drone against him. But for a brief moment, I'm sure you see the same thing. The conversations that were happening inside U.S. government buildings about this. That would be a game changer, because suddenly the U.S. would have to be able to articulate how its policies are different. And when we talk about these issues, I bring up China and I bring up Russia. And so with China, there's a large Uyghur population in Virginia, not very far from us. And China thinks it's at war with the Uyghurs. I mean, it does say that. Or Russia would say this about Chechen rebels, if there's a Chechen rebel in DuPont Circle. How do we say that that is different? That if Russia thinks it's in an armed conflict with Chechen rebels, and there's a Chechen rebel here in Washington, D.C., that they can't launch a drone strike against them? And there are a number of reasons, like the U.S. has a functioning criminal justice system and it can arrest the person. Probably wouldn't, though, because we wouldn't have a reason to arrest someone who happens to be living here who is a Chechen rebel. But when faced with these questions, I think that's when people in the U.S. government have to really try to bend their minds around it and think about what they want the long-term policy to look like. For a long time, they haven't done so, because I think they've just felt they had more pressing matters. As much as I disagree with a lot of what's happened, I know that most of the people, particularly when it comes to targeted killing, less so with detention, but people are doing this because they think it's the right thing to do. They think that they are killing people who are about to kill Americans, and they think that they're keeping this country safe. I don't think that's true, but I am not suggesting that they have some malicious intent. But I think we're starting to reach a point where we can step back a little bit as a society and have these conversations, not just inside the U.S., but with the broader international community, and talk about what we want the future to look like.